Hey guys, welcome back to another video on Inside the Vault. Today we're diving into something that a lot of people start thinking about once they get deeper into BoBA singles. Where certain cards come from, why some trade higher than others, and what collectors are actually prioritizing when they buy one card. Instead of treating this like a checklist or a Q&A, I want to walk through how BoBA singles are designed, how collectors think about them, and why the market behaves the way it does. Once you understand the structure behind BoBA singles, everything else starts to make a lot more sense. Let's dive in. One of the biggest things to understand right away is the difference between hobby and retail. Not because one is better than the other, but because they're built for different experiences. Some inserts are made specifically for retail. Grillin' and Chillin', for example, retail-only inserts lean heavily into fire and ice themes. Slime is another retail exclusive insert that's quickly become a fan favorite, featuring those glow weapon types. Great Grandma's Linoleum also lives exclusively in retail and appears across multiple weapon types, so Brawl, Steel, Fire, Ice, Glow, and Hex. On the hobby side, there are inserts you're only going to see in hobby and jumbo packs. Grandma's Linoleum, the green ones, is a great example of that. It's a similar idea to Great Grandma's Linoleum, but it comes from a completely different pull situation. Bubblegum battle foils fall into the same category as well. Once you see that contrast, it starts to explain why some cards are thought about differently the moment they hit the market. Collectors don't just care about the card itself, they care about where it came from. Now, not every insert lives in just one lane. Things like Blizzards, 80s Rad, Coliseum battle foils, logo foils, mixtapes, super foils, Miami Ice, and Fire Tracks are all inserts that can show up in any pack type, sometimes tied to specific weapon types and others across several. And once you understand that mix, retail exclusives, hobby exclusives, and cards that live everywhere, the next question almost always comes up. Which singles actually matter the most? And the honest answer is, there isn't a single answer, and that's not a flaw. It's part of what makes BoBA interesting. If you're looking at it from a pure scarcity standpoint, super short printed cards are always going to matter no matter what the product is. When something is tough to pull, collectors naturally pay attention. But scarcity isn't the whole story in Bo Jackson Battle Arena. Some collectors are drawn to certain inserts, some care deeply about specific heroes, others focus on power because they want cards that are higher power for gameplay. And most people don't just fit into one of those categories, they blend all of it together, and that mix is also why you start seeing price differences almost immediately once singles start trading. A lot of that comes down to familiarity. Inserts with well understood rarity tend to trade higher because collectors know what they're getting into. There's comfort in knowing how often a card actually shows up, but power matters too. Higher power heroes naturally draw more demand, especially from players and hybrid collectors. When power and rarity line up, that's usually when prices start to separate. And when you watch how people actually buy singles, you can see that play out in real time. Most collectors tend to lead with power first and then let rarity help separate cards from there. But that's not a strict rule. For example, a 1-of-1 super foil is still going to turn heads no matter what the power is. But it is a pattern that shows up again and again. In general, higher power heroes tend to sell for more, as we talked about earlier. For example, we've got a 200 power Ken Griffey Jr. Hex Auto that sold for $52.50, and right behind that is the Dr. J Super, which closed at $5,100. One of my favorite recent sales is the Ken Griffey Jr. The Kid Green Battle Foil, which sold for $2,300. And then you also have Rocket, inspired by Roger Clemens, on a Bubblegum Auto that sold for $17.50. There are a few other examples that I'll throw up on screen as well, but the point here is pretty simple. As power goes up, demand usually follows, and when demand follows, prices tend to move with it. That doesn't mean power is the only thing that matters, but more often than not, it's the first thing collectors react to when they're buying singles. But the more interesting insight comes from comparing similar cards. When you look at Great Grandma's Linoleum next to Grandma's Linoleum, or retail icon battle foils next to hobby colored battle foils, that's when you really start to see how availability and where a card comes from can affect the value, even when the designs are closely related. Let's start with Grandma's Linoleum versus Great Grandma's Linoleum. Here on the screen is Javalanche, inspired by Jamal Murray. His Great Grandma's Linoleum sold for $19.99. That is $19.99, while the hobby exclusive Grandma's Linoleum sold for $50. So over double the price for being the hobby version. Up next is D-Harp, inspired by Dylan Harper. His Great Grandma's Linoleum sold for $215, while the Grandma's Linoleum version sold for $260. And that's really the takeaway from these comparisons. The heroes are the same, but where the card comes from and how available it is still changes how the market responds. That's what you're seeing play out in these sales. Once you start looking at BoBA singles through that lens, where the card came from, how rare it is, how powerful it is, who wants it, the whole singles market starts to feel logical. There isn't one right way to collect BoBA, and that flexibility is exactly what makes this side of the hobby so interesting. If this video helped you, make sure you're subscribed to Inside the Vault. We will keep breaking down BoBA, not just what's happening, but why it's happening. We'll see you next time, Inside the Vault.